All right, our next section is obedience and conformity. So this links in quite well with our status and power. It follows along a similar vein because we're still in our social psychology topic. So obedience is where an individual or group behaves in a certain way because of the commands of someone in a position of authority or high status, like we were talking about before. If we perceive it as legitimate authority, which we were talking about legitimate power earlier, it is highly likely we'll obey, maybe because we want to please those in authority or avoid negative consequences for disobedience. So I talked about obedience quite a lot earlier. So again, it links in very much with like the status and power, because we're more likely to obey someone with a high status, or we're more likely to obey someone who has power over us, whether that's legitimate power or coercive power. Those are all factors that influence how likely we are to behave. So for example, Stanford prison experiment, that was more specifically, that case study is more specifically related to like status and power, but it definitely does explore obedience as well, because the guards actually did terrible, terrible things when I'm sure most of them wouldn't have done any of those terrible behaviors under normal circumstances. And another group that was explored quite a lot by research is also the Nazi Party, because obedient, very loyal, very patriotic followers would carry out the orders of superiors that they never ever would have done under normal circumstances. So there's some research that we're going to look at surrounding that as well. Oh, and that's right here. That's Milgram's study. So Milgram, his study was inspired by observing the Nazis in World War II. He wanted to know what motivated their obedience. And an interesting consideration for that is, should people be held individually accountable for their actions, or are they just acting in obedience based off coercive power? That's a brain teaser for you. What do you think? So Milgram's study. So participants in Milgram's study were told that little research had been done in the area of using punishment as a teaching method. So to get people to be more like okay and engaged in the study, and to get participants, like they like opposed that it was like a really valuable study. They're like, well, not a lot of research has been done in this area, so we're going to do some research to explore using punishment as a teaching method. But that's what the participant was told. That is actually not what the study is about. The study was actually about obedience. Will these people obey and hurt another person? Or will they say like, no, like I'm not going to hurt another person? So you can see how listen out for how like status and power is going to like influence and come into play here as well. So the teacher was the participant, and they were placed in front of a control panel. Or sorry, a better way to say that would be that the participant each time was allocated the role of the teacher in the scenario. And the other role was the learner, who was strapped into the machine out of view but within earshot. So the interesting thing with this here is to give a little bit more context. So we have a teacher and we have a learner. The teacher is the actual participant. They were allocated to the role of the teacher, but they were told that the learner was also a participant and that they'd been randomly allocated to these two roles. But the learner, every time, it was like rigged, even though they didn't know it. The learner was always Mr. Wallace, who was like a planted Confederate, and he was strapped into the machine. So the teacher was told to like read out questions, and every time the learner got one wrong, they would punish them by giving them an electric shock, which would be administered by the machine that we're strapped into. And Mr. Williams, so another like planned actor, was the experimenter. So Mr. Williams was pretending to be the person running the experiment. So Mr. Williams our experimenter would be interacting with the teacher, the participant. So like I said, when the learner got the wrong answer, they would get an electric shock. The teacher or the participant actually had to administer this electric shock by like pressing the button or turning the dial or whatever, and at increasing intensities. So every time they got it wrong, they would shock them more and more and more. And the experimenter would encourage them to keep going. So this is where obedience really comes into it. So if, for example, the learner kept getting it wrong and they kept shocking. Oh, and by the way, the participants were told the shocks are painful, but they're not dangerous. So they were told that. So did that influence the outcomes? Maybe yes, maybe no. But every time the learner got a question wrong, they would get an increasingly painful electric shock. And then if the participant was like, oh, like they're kind of like screaming out in pain, because again, they were within earshot, and they might want to stop, the experimenter would encourage them to keep going. Like, no, like this is really valuable research. Please keep going. Like keep shocking them kind of thing. So what were the results? Yikes, they were scary. To summarize, the level of obedience was shockingly high. And again, limitations, definitely ethics, psychological stress, withdrawal rights, and we'll have a look at some more limitations in some of the next few slides as to which is kind of along the lines of like factors that could have influenced their obedience. So, for example, they believed they were participating in valuable psychological research. So they felt obligated to keep going. So like, well, this is really important research. Like I have to do my role well, even though I feel really bad. Maybe potentially that was a factor that influenced their obedience. Because again, they were just hypothesizing about what are the different factors that influence their obedience. So let's have a look at this chart. This is the level of shocks that like the participants went up to. So I can't remember if it started at 15 or a little bit higher, but pretty much each shock went up in a 15 volt increment. 300 volts was an intense shock, 315 extreme intensity, 375 was danger, severe shock, and this was actually written on the board, by the way. They could see that 375 volts said danger, severe shock, but they were still told to do it if the learner got a question wrong. And they could see that 450 volts just had XXX. And here's the sad news. 65% of the participants obeyed and went all the way, even though the learner, Mr. Williams or Mr. Wallace, whichever one was the learner, the learner was Mr. Wallace, even though the learner would be like screaming out in pain and by that point asking them to stop. And I think at one point the learner even was like instructed to go silent to see how that would like influence their reactions. The participant, i.e. the teacher, kept going 65% of the way, all the way to 450 volts. You can see that a few of the people, 2.5% went all the way to danger, severe shock. 2.5 went to extreme, 2.5, 10%, and 12.5% stopped at intense shock. But it's quite shocking the degree of obedience that they observed in this study. These were just like normal everyday participants that were asked to come into a room and administer electric shocks to someone every time they got a question wrong. And these normal everyday people obeyed because the experimenter would urge them, please, please keep going. There was a script that the experimenter would follow to urge them to keep going, to encourage their obedience. And that resulted in a really, really high level of obedience that people were literally willing to give another human being terribly painful electric shocks. So very, very interesting findings from Milgram's study. So like I said, why do we think there was such a high level of obedience in this study? First, before we get to that, Milgram concluded that people were more likely to perform actions contrary to their beliefs and wishes if they're instructed by someone in authority. So Milgram's study is about obedience, and his conclusions, so this is like the conclusion of his study, was that people are more likely to obey even if they don't want to, if they're instructed by someone in authority. So, for example, in the context of this study, they were more likely to obey and give someone the shot even if they didn't want to, because they were instructed by someone in authority. So Milgram actually used this research to suggest that many members of the Nazi Party were merely being obedient because they were instructed by someone in authority, which is very interesting when you think about the implications of that. That was Milgram's hypothesis. But coming back to what were the different reasons why there was such a high level of obedience? So this is really good information if you were like evaluating the study or the outcomes. The first one, which I think I might have mentioned before, is that the study was conducted at Yale, and that's a really prestigious institute. So people, because they were at such a prestigious institute, like maybe that influenced them and caused them to be more obedient. Secondly, or maybe this was the one I mentioned before, people thought that it was really valuable research. Like they were told little research has been done in the area of using punishment as a teaching method, as a teaching tool. So they thought that it was really important this research had to be done. So well, I just have to keep going. This is important research. So maybe that influenced the level of obedience. They also thought the learner had volunteered. So they thought the learner had volunteered to be in that role. So they were like, well, okay, if the learner was okay with this before, then I should probably just like keep going. And they also felt obliged to keep going because they were actually paid to be a part of the study. And because they'd been paid, that increased the sense of obligation. So like, oh, I've been paid. I really should go through with it, even though I really want to stop and I feel really terrible. And a lot of them probably really regretted it later and were really shocked by their actions. I don't know for sure, but I am assuming. And they also thought the roles had been randomly allocated. So they're like, well, the roles were randomly allocated. Maybe they just thought, I don't know, the luck of the dice. I guess they just have to deal with it. That could have been me, even though we know that someone was planted to be the learner. This experiment was also conducted many, many years ago when people weren't as aware of ethics. They were also reassured that the shocks were painful but not dangerous. So even though they might have felt really bad for causing the learner pain, they might have been like, oh, like, I know they're in pain, but like, it's not dangerous. And also it's really valuable research. So maybe I should keep going, even if I feel really guilty on the inside. The learner kept responding to the questions up until a certain point, which indicated a willingness to participate. So even though they would scream, the learner would scream in pain when they were shocked, they would keep responding to the questions. So maybe the participant would assume that like, oh, like, well, okay, they're still responding, so they're probably still willing, so I better keep going. The legitimacy of authority figure. So the experimenter did have that power and authority over them, and the experimenter would urge them to keep going. So that is another factor that again could have influenced why there was such a high level of obedience. And again, these were all kind of things that were hypothesized.